Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, April 9th, and it feels to me like we are playing this big game of chicken with the world economy and the US military, and this
Yeah,
is feels like to me they were getting to the point where we're going to find out whether or not, who's
yeah.
going to be on top and if we're going to have a massive war. What do you make of what's going on right now? What's the biggest story?
Well, it's hard to say which is the biggest story. I guess that there's so many major stories and, um, competing with each other that it's hard to pull one out. But I'll just start quickly with the trade war. I'm sure that you know um, that after Trump imposed an additional 50% in response to um, China's retaliatory tariffs of 34%. The Chinese came back and saw him, to use a poker metaphor. They raised their tariffs an additional 50%. So now we have a situation where Chinese goods are being taxed at a rate of 104% as they come into this country, and American goods that are going to China are being taxed at a rate of 84%. And that, is clearly going to, if it doesn't entirely stop trade, it's going to severely restrict, severely reduce trade between the two countries, this is an enormous event because these are the trade between the U.S. and China is huge. And it's, I think, unquestionably, it's the most important trade relationship in the world. And now it's just in a matter of a few days, it's being pretty much entirely suppressed. Unless there's a very sudden reversal, that we're going to see an almost entire, vanishing of this trade. And the consequences are going to be huge. I think, China saw that this might happen and decided ahead of time that if they come after us in this way, we're not going to bend our knee. We're not going to use Trump's crude and colorful language, kiss his rear end, as many other countries, so Trump claims, are doing right now. We're going to hold our ground because we believe we can win this war. And I think they're right. I think that they have the advantage in this, that there's going to be a lot more suffering in the U.S. than there is going to be in China. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think there's any question that the Chinese people are going to rally, around the flag, the Chinese flag, and support Xi Jinping in this, because they see that this was not initiated by themselves. This is like a foreign attack. It is an attack by a foreign country on them. And so, they're going to respond patriotically. They're going to be willing to tighten their belts because they're going to, especially certain industries are going to suffer. But they'll survive it, and I think the Chinese people will remain united. Now, it's a different thing in the U.S. Because this is entirely voluntary. It came out of the blue. There's outside of the MAGA base, those people that are just kind of see Trump as a messiah figure. I think the Americans did not want this to happen. They weren't asking for it. And if they start to see their pocketbook severely affected, over the next few months and years, they're going to be angry. It's going to be that they're going to try to bring it to an end. And they'll support measures in Congress to do it. I think there may be, legislative means to bring this to an end. That's a possibility. Or they'll have to wait for the next presidential election. I think there's just no question in my mind that the Chinese are going to win this war. That's just looking at one aspect of it. But just looking at that aspect, which I think is very important, you see that China has the upper hand.
Could you tell me what kind of negative effects this would have for China? Because the propaganda that's coming out of here in the United States is saying that Trump actually has all the cards because of this huge trade deficit. It's something 5-1. So that way, this is going to affect China a lot more because they can't sell their goods here in the United States. So all of a sudden, this is going to cause massive unemployment in China, and the people are going to rebel and throw Xi Jinping out of office. It's kind of what you hear.
Right. Well, that's not going to happen partly for the reasons that I just stated. But also, it's just that the U.S. is just not in that dominant position that it once was. Maybe back in the 1980s when China was just emerging from the Maoist years and were, starting to build up their export industries, the U.S. was hugely important, and that was true, through the 90s and into the 2000s as well. But now that the whole world is catching up with the U.S. The U.S., like I think I said in a recent program, only accounts for 13% of global market demand. That's just not critical. Again, in that time, we find like the BRICS countries are growing faster. They account for more of the world economy than the G7. This is an entirely different world. So China, again, it'll be a blow, but it's not like there's a huge world out there, that they're already selling to, and they can work further to develop those markets. So, in the end, some people have argued that Trump always puts it in these terms, like, they're cheating us, and now we're going to, we're saying an end to the cheating. We're going to punish you. Go stand in the corner until you agree not to cheat anymore. That's almost, I don't think I'm really exaggerating the kind of language that or not much, not by much, the language that Trump uses. But, that's basically his thinking on this. And it's wrong. It's actually, you could even argue it's the other way around. China supplies us with cheap goods, and we spend money that we don't have to buy those goods. I mean, this is, who really has been getting the advantage, in this relationship? And now this is going to end. We can't get those cheap goods. What do we have? We just have we have the world's reserve currency. We can produce dollars and buy in excess of, of what we consume, in excess of what we produce as a result. But I would say, it just seems to me, I'm not an economist, but that these tariffs actually are going to put the U.S., its role as, the provider of the world's reserve currency. It'll put that role at risk. It already is at risk for reasons that we discussed earlier. But this is going to be do further damage to the reserve currency status of the U.S. dollar. Because that's the thing, is that, dollars are in demand partly because, is in connection with trade, right? You sold things to the U.S. and you got these dollars from them, right? And so, you have to hang on to those dollars. And what the Chinese would do is they would, in other countries as well, is buy U.S. Treasury bonds and therefore support the U.S. economy and allow the U.S. economy to continue to spend beyond its means. But when you shut down trade, that whole cycle comes to an end. And it just seems to me that that's going to be do real serious damage to the U.S. dollar. I don't see how it can't. It's, again, I think the U.S. really, the recent U.S. presidents, it's not just Trump, but it was true of Biden also, right? They're living in the past. They still think that this is like, the 1990s or even the 1940s after the end of World War II. We can just, the whole world depends on us. We can do what we want. Every other country just has to accept, our diktats and bend their knees. And it's just not, we saw it with Russia, and now we're seeing it with China. They're just getting a firm no. We're not playing this game anymore. We're not afraid of you. We can live without you.
I saw something just before we start the podcast that Xi Jinping told the Chinese banks to no longer acquire dollars, something like this. So is that the beginning of de-dollarization? Do you think that's happening, that's what we're seeing? And what will that mean for the U.S. if it does happen? You said it was already a threat to the world reserve currency status. So
right. Yeah,
what does that mean for America?
Sure.
For the world?
Okay, well, I mean, and most directly, if the Chinese are not going to continue to accumulate dollars, which they do in the form of these U.S. Treasury bonds, that means that we have to finance a greater share of those bonds ourselves. And what does that mean? And said, when they buy those bonds, they keep the interest rates down. They stop buying them. Then those interest rates start to go up because you have to draw in more cash. You have to make your bonds more attractive. You lose a buyer, and you need to get a new buyer. The only way you can do that is actually to increase the yields on those bonds. So that, immediately it puts us in, it worsens our fiscal situation. We're already tremendously in debt. We're already, spending, $1 trillion on interest every year. And that's going to go up. We're already in a kind of a,
death spiral.
In a death spiral. That's right. We're circling the drain. That's what I was going to say, but that's just going to accelerate if you do that.
Okay, so then well, it sounds like, just continuing the poker metaphor, it sounds like we don't have a very strong hand. America doesn't. Trump is trying to bluff. China's calling our bluff. And we're done. And instead of, cash just saying, okay, we fold, we're going all in, right? That's Trump's only strategy, partly because he thinks he has a stronger hand than maybe he already has.
Yeah.
And also he just has this commitment. Once you publicly stated that you're going to do this, it's really hard to pull back. It'll be a lot of egg on his face if he does. So I think most likely we're going to continue this. If we slap on more, I heard Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank saying that we need to go 400% tariffs. We just go all out. And if we do this, you think that China is never going to fold. They know that they have the stronger hand, and that this could potentially completely bring down the U.S. dollar, the U.S. economy, right? This could wreck everything.
It could be. Yeah. We've been heading towards, our condition has been fragile, and we've been heading towards some sort of collapse of the dollar for a long time. But, these trends can stretch out for years and decades sometimes. So, I haven't made any firm prediction. It just seems like this, is putting it at immediate risk. It will be sooner than it would have been otherwise. And it could be very soon that the dollar collapses. I'm not going to make a firm prediction, but this really is, has created a very perilous situation for the dollar.
Could we start to see hyperinflation? Do you think that's a possibility?
This obviously there are going to be inflationary effects from this because, that's what happens when you impose tariffs. You increase the cost of imported goods. And we have been, to a great extent, been relying on cheap imported goods. That's one thing that's kept inflation down in this country over the last few decades. When you end that, or you increase the prices of those items, a lot of them will stop coming in, from China. They'll come from other countries maybe that that don't have such severe tariffs on them, but there was a reason that we're getting them from China, right? We're getting from China because that was the best combination of quality and price. That's what a buyer does. He looks for that, and then so we'll get some worse combination of quality and price. We'll get probably shoddier goods at higher prices. That's what's going to happen, and or in some cases, there will be a domestic manufacturer that steps up. But I think, that is going to be a long-term process, again, because our manufacturing capabilities have been, greatly reduced. Our manufacturing sector has been hollowed out over the recent decades. That was a decades-long process, and I think it could be a decades-long process to build those industries up again. At least it's going to be years. And that's something I talked about. It's just like, okay, you can say there are potentially some beneficial effects for at least certain sectors of the U.S. population. If we begin to replace, we go through this process of import substitution, we begin developing our own industry. But that's a slow process, and I don't know that people are going to have patience for that. And I don't even know how successful that's going to be, even in the long run.
Okay, exciting.
Yeah.
So we're going all in on this economic war with a losing hand, and it sounds like it's likely that we're going all in militarily, potentially with Iran. We've already gone in pretty far with Ukraine with a losing hand, and we saw the outcome of that.
Yeah.
We're seeing us being humiliated on the global stage, not even be able to stop the Houthis, and Trump's publicly posting war crimes about our strikes on the Houthis. It's not helping our global image at all. And then our military might, I think, is being definitely put into question. Russia stood up, and we were shown to be not as almighty as we thought we were. The Houthis stood up, and now everybody's like, well, we can't even take the Houthis on. What are we doing? And now we're threatening Iran. So it sounds like we're at this crossroads now where we are moving to this point where we are defining our hegemony on this. This is it. It's putting it on the line. Am I overstating it? Like our economic hegemony, our military hegemony, like this is what America is all about. Our power projection, our ability to boldly and dominate the world is now being put into question. We talk about people standing up. Russia stood up. Yemen stood up. Iran standing up. China standing up. And there's always this big question as well before, who do we want to lead the world? Do we want the United States to lead the world, or do you want a country like China? And it used to always be like, of course you want the United States. But thanks to our position in situations like Gaza and also with Ukraine and Russia, people are like, morally, we don't think we want the U.S. to lead the world either. So is that how you kind of assess the situation where we're at?
Yeah, obviously we're staking a lot of U.S. prestige on these moves, or at least the Trump administration is, Trump and himself in particular, and yeah, if he fails, and I think he's bound to fail, it's going to be disastrous, for him personally, but for the United States as well. I think that the U.S. reputation has already been severely damaged for the reasons that you gave, but it's going to be further damaged. Our soft power, which was really, a part of what made us such an influential country around the world, has really taken a beating, and it's taking a further beating now. I mean, like the 1-2 punch, the combination of Biden and Trump, the zombie president followed by the lunatic buffoon. It's just really, much of the world must be looking at it and saying, what happened? What's in the water there? I find myself wondering that too. I can only laugh, but I also want to cry. I mean, this is the country I grew up in, and I've loved, and I used to take great pride, especially when I was younger, and being an American, and it's just harder and harder to do that now.
What is in the water? Why are we doing this? It's just hubris. It's just some American exceptionalism has poisoned our minds that much. Is that?
Yeah, well, that's part of it, and we've talked a lot about that. But then there's just this general cultural degradation. I think there's no question about it. Just to give you an example, it's just like, Trump was boasting, I think it was yesterday, that all these little countries, their governments have called me up and they're begging, please, sir, we'll do whatever. Yeah, they kiss my A, that's...
You can say it, Dad.
Oh, I say, okay. Yeah, I'm just wondering what our speech was. Okay.
I don't think we have little kids. I only have little kids watching. So.
You're right. Okay. All right. Yeah, and it's not a particularly bad word anyway, but but yeah, just using that kind of crude language is not something a previous president would have done, really. It's just, and there's a reason for not doing that. It's not just, okay, fuddy-duddy, silly, etiquette or something. That, the president is supposed to carry himself in a dignified manner and speak respectfully. He can be very firm, and, up to the point of even launching a war in some cases, it might be justified. I think it's very, very rarely justified. But just to this kind of language is something that's heard, for example, by the Chinese people. And that just is going to increase a resolve to just hang in there. No, we're not doing that. It's just like this. We're not dealing with this guy. And just imagine, if you're dealing with somebody personally over some personal issue, and somebody starts to talk about that in a haughty manner, that you just say, yes, forget him. Even if that means some major economic loss, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. It is this hubris, but it's also this cultural degradation, which includes, this kind of really bombastic and crude talk, but also, increasing tolerance of war crimes, as we've mentioned too. I mean, all of these things together are they're very worrying signs, and again, the much of the world sees it, unfortunately, like within the U.S., everybody tends to see things through this partisan, hyper partisan lenses. So it's just like, they think, well, if we can just get the Democrats back. And I think if you step back and look at it, it's just like people see that the whole country is declining in different ways. And yeah, there will be changes in policies, but it's not all about Trump or just about Biden. It's both of these presidents could not have, neither man could have been president, a couple of decades ago. There's no question about it, maybe even a decade ago. But that's the best we can produce at this point. This is what's happened to our political system and our culture.
Well, maybe that's showing that our political system is working. If Biden and Trump, that embodies what America has become now. Just this, like it's amazed me. Like, is this the best we have? But it's like, well, this is maybe representative of kind of the state of America. We got somebody that's so senile, and then we got Trump. It's just I don't know. But what worries me now is that if these tariff impacts start to really hurt the everyday American, that's when you have a real crisis on your hand, and that's when Trump is like, okay, better deflect and start a war. Do you think that's likely?
Maybe true. It's certainly possible. Yeah, I think we talked about it last time, and it's certainly possible. So if we switch over to Iran, there have been developments there too, right? The Iranians have agreed to indirect talks. But that's something they said earlier, and they've, in fact, have had indirect talks with the Americans over the years, including during the Biden years. So this is not some sort of major concession on their part. That's already long been their stance, vis-a-vis the U.S. Trump reported it as direct talks, but he was flatly contradicted by the Iranians. So these talks are going to be held on Saturday in Oman. And we'll see what happens. I mean, there's a chance. I've always said there's a chance that this could be averted, that Trump might take something, call it a concession, and say that he made a deal. Maybe there really, really wasn't anything substantive there. But, we've seen Trump do things like that in the past. But I think, again, there's the other possibility is that, which appears to be the more likely outcome, is that they're going to insist on the demands that have already been listed, which Iran has flat out said they cannot accept, and it's clear, they cannot accept. And then, the negotiators, the American negotiators, will leave Oman and say, "Well, we tried. You see, we tried the path of peace, of diplomacy." But the Iranians rejected it, and then this will just be, give them the right to carry through with the attack that they've always wanted to carry through, or at least provide them with a certain amount of cover or justification. That's unfortunately, I think there's a very high possibility that that's what's going to happen.
And if they reject, Trump's ultimatum, do you think we will just go straight to a bombing campaign, to war with Iran? Because that's kind of how Trump's been talking about it. Netanyahu was in the Oval Office the other day, and there's some questions, and he was just saying, like, look, Iran's got to take the deal, or else it'll be really, really bad for them. It's going to be bad, and we know what that means. Open threat, like we'll start bombing the hell out of you, and then we know what will happen, right? Yeah. Well, can you play it out for me? Tell us what will happen if we do this bombing. I know you've said it before, but I mean, what Iran's military capabilities, are we just completely underestimating them? Is that what it is? Yeah. With the United States?
Yeah, I think certain people, again, like I've said, which have always been there, and the anti-Iran hawks have always been there and always been wanting a war with Iran. They, I think they don't really even care. They don't care. Maybe there are a lot of Americans who are going to die and some ships will be sunk, but they've always wanted to destroy Iran. Part of, many of them are ardent Zionists, and they see, Iran as the kind of the final, the the last standing adversary, of any real significance against Zionism, and that they've knocked out all the others. And this is the one, this is a grand prize. And if they can bring down Iran, then that will be the ultimate victory for Israel, and greater Israel can be established. So there'll be nothing to resist that. I think that's the way they think. That's the way Netanyahu talks, and he's echoed, in the United States. So, we've always had these people who maybe understand this is going to be a difficult fight. And then I think others, probably Trump included, it has places too much trust in faith in American superiority. You just can't believe that Iran could really do anything to hurt us. You get that too. There have been the realists, and I'm sure they're still there all along, that have prevented the previous attempts, to attack Iran. Because we have gotten close in the past, most recently, the end of the Biden administration. I think they're always there, but they could just be shouted down. Again, if you have a president who just chooses not to listen, he just don't want, he'll go for it. And I think yesterday, or not yesterday, in the previous program, you were saying that he seems to have some sort of, God complex. Trump does, especially since the assassination attempt, which he survived, miraculously. Maybe we're seeing that again with the tariffs, that he's gone. This is something that he's always wanted to do. That's clear. He's talked about tariffs for years and years and years before, he even ran for president back in 2016. And now this is his second term, and he thinks that he's there to do great things, and these are one of the great things that he wants to do. So he's going ahead with it. He's going all the way, and it may be the same thing with Iran. It's just like this is one of the great things that he's always wanted to do, because he has always expressed a loathing of the Iranian government and the desire to overthrow it. And so he just may think, kind of like Netanyahu himself, that this is our chance to do great things. I'm afraid that maybe is a psychology.
There's not that much support for war with Iran, though, within America, is there? There
are the Zionists, and we have a significant proportion of our population are Zionists, and they will go along with it. And many of them, even if it turns out to be disastrous, they may stick with it. But I say, by and large, no. Probably even in the Republican Party, is just, I don't know what the opinion polls do, but especially if it starts to get messy, the people are going to be mad. They don't like these forever wars. They don't like, their soldiers coming back in body bags. It could lead to a lot of anger.
Right. I think I saw a poll that the majority of Americans now have a negative view of Israel. It's not a large majority. I think it's 53%. But that number is going to grow, especially if we start seeing American soldiers come back in body bags from these bases in the Middle East. If we pull out an attack on Iran, I just don't think that we would be able to sustain an all-out war with Iran if we try to enforce a draft and start conscripting people. I just don't see it happening here in the U.S. People don't want to go across the world to die for Israel. And I think more and more people are understanding now the role of Israel in these wars in the Middle East. It's something that I think a lot of people weren't fully aware of, but a lot of people are going down that rabbit hole, and it's just going to further do that and then continue. And as that trend develops, it's also that is a nail in the coffin, I think, for the Israeli state. The Zionists won't be able to stay in control here in the United States if the majority of the U.S. population realizes what's happening. Do you think so?
Yeah. No, I think you put it very well. I agree.
I think a big problem that we've had as Americans, and a lot of Americans are waking up to it, is nobody wants to be the bad guy. It's hard to view your country as being the bad guy. And most people don't really have a strong opinion of what we consider the typical bad guy countries like China or Iran or North Korea. It's like, yeah, our media propaganda tells us this, we're like, yeah, they're bad. But what it really comes down to, we don't really have that visceral hatred for these countries. We just kind of have a sort of a very superficial hatred. It's just like, oh, that's because my country has told me these are bad guys.
Right.
But what we're seeing now, thanks to Israel and what they're doing in Gaza, is just so evil. The killing of these Red Crescent paramedics, the killing of all these children and women, the videos of, you see starving and starved babies and children that have been killed by these bombs. It's so horrific that it does create this visceral hatred and this idea that America really is bad. America, it really is evil. And I think that it's difficult pill to swallow as an American to come to that, to come to terms with that. But I feel like that's what we have to do. And the world is doing that, right? I mean, do you believe that this is, I'm not even sure what the question I have here, but I think that we're going through some type of identity crisis change for so many Americans to come to that realization that this is wrong, this is evil, or our country's bad. And what is that going to do for a country? And how do we handle those feelings?
Yeah. Well, that's a huge question. I don't really know. I mean, those are the kind of things I think you cannot make firm predictions about. But the trends you describe are there. It's just the fact that a majority of Americans have a negative view of Israel is extraordinary. And, that didn't seem possible even a couple of years ago. But of course, because of the attack and the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, that's what we're seeing. Yeah, well, I don't know how it's going to play out. But again, there are those. What you're saying about all these other countries, like negative views of particularly, let's say, North Korea or Russia or, whatever the country might be. I think a lot of those, like you say, those are not deeply held opinions, and they can be changed in an instant. It's like, and we've seen that, I think, with Trump started to say some positive things about Russia, and then there's, like the positive views of Russia just bump up by 10 or 20% in the opinion polls overnight, and that's, most people do not have strong opinions about these countries. But again, the exception is Israel, which we've talked about before. Now, there is growing resistance and actual real hatred of Israel growing in this country, but it's still a minority position. And the other side does have firmly held beliefs about Israel, and they've got their hands on the levers of power. So, they're not going to go down without some huge fight. Whether we're talking about war in the Middle East or suppression of free speech in this country, which is another thing that we're seeing, or like or it seems like the opening salvo in an attack on the right to express criticism of Israel. Still, obviously, a lot of people, ourselves included, can speak very freely about it, but certain people, certain places like universities are being targeted over that, and it may be the beginning of a larger war. It's just like these people, again, they are very committed to Israel, and if they sense that they're really losing control, and I think they are sensing that, they'll start to lash out, and they'll start to employ measures that were previously unthinkable. I think we're seeing the beginnings of that. So it could be very, very ugly. Again, we'll have a real conflict within the country, not just a conflict overseas.
Don't you think that will just further the demise of Zionism in general, Zionism in the United States?
I think, no question, in the long run, there may be short-term victories, and you can say that actually they are experiencing those short-term victories, like, the threats to defund universities is having an effect. Those administrations, university administrations within the country, are bending their knee to the Trump administration and, promising not to allow any more demonstrations critical of Israel.
That's
and
crazy.
even to police their curriculums and make sure that there aren't courses that are deemed to be anti-Semitic, which really means just critical of Zionism.
Well, these are university students. They're supposed to be, above average intelligence. Hopefully, they should be smart. Don't they? Could they realize the hypocrisy of this? That okay, you can criticize America on the campus, but there's one country in the world you can, and that's Israel, the one that's committing a genocide that they all can see on their phones.
Yeah. I'm sure. Yeah, that's what I would say is in the short term. Maybe you could say it's a victory, but I'm sure it's been a very eye-opening experience for a lot of these people. For the students in particular. And these students, especially these elite universities, the ones that have been targeted, are future leaders of the country. So, somewhere, I think the long-term outlook for Israel, and support for Zionism in general is not good in this country. I think it will come to an end. It's just a question of when. It could still be, many years from now, but if I were a Zionist, I would be afraid, and I think, again, the intelligent thing would be to actually slow down, uphold the ceasefire in Israel, in Gaza, that kind of thing. I don't think it would stop this process, this decline in support for Israel, but it would slow it down. But actually, they're just doubling down on everything, and I think that's going to speed it up. I think they've made a mistake, too, about, they've had, for so long, they've just had sort of almost total power within this country. And because of U.S. support for Israel, that Israel has been able to act with impunity, and it still does. But that has caused them to I think, overestimate their long-term strengths. And, and to do things that are going to hurt them again in the long run. I think you can say they'll have short-term successes. Like, I think we just have to be honest. They had a short-term success in Lebanon. It was pretty horrible, and in Syria. But all of these things, this is an unsustainable course. It's just like reigning through terror is not the way to go. It's obviously eating away at that support that they had, that rock solid support that really did used to exist in the U.S. is no longer there. They still have control over the institutions, but the foundations are crumbling. And by the foundations, I mean like future generations are turning away from them.
Are there many Zionists that understand this and are advocating a slower approach? Maybe they still have that, they still believe in the idea of greater Israel and taking the land, but they say, hey, let's roll it back to what we were doing before October 7th when we was incremental, a long-term process. It seems like that even if you were a Zionist, like you're saying, like that should be a pretty common sense conclusion. You understand that your whole project is beginning to crumble and fall apart because of what's happening in Gaza. It's very, very clear that people want to say, well, what's with this rise in anti-Semitism? Where's it coming from? It's like, well, I heard genocide is a pretty big cause of anti-Semitism.
Right.
It's like, so maybe if they stop that, they could get away with it. But why is there many Zionists that are advocating for that? Or
I'm sure there's some. Well, I can speak for the Writers for Haaretz, which is the main left-wing publication in Israel. And some of those people are, again, a small number of them are truly concerned about the lot of the Palestinians. And they understand what's happening. But many of them, and some of them I would put in the camp that you described. It's not like they really are concerned about the Palestinians, but they understand this is hurting Israel's image. And again, this is on the left. We're talking about like 10% of the population. So even within, they're still kind of a minority within a minority. But a lot of even these, so-called leftists don't seem to be concerned about the genocide at all. They're still living in the past. It's like if there's a rise in anti-Semitism, it must be because of those just bad anti-Semites. They just hate us without reason. That's kind of it seems like they haven't left that mindset. And, it seems like you feel like screaming and it says, like, if you're really concerned about anti-Semitism, stop the genocide. You really got to focus on that. But even within the left, I think that awareness, the need to stop the genocide is a minority position. Now, I think you maybe see it more commonly in the U.S. We had, it was a couple of years ago that Chuck Schumer, made a speech against Netanyahu. And I think a lot of, I don't know that it's a majority, it's probably still a minority of American Jews, other than the young ones who really are turning away from Israel and Zionism. But let's say a majority of older Jews that really support Netanyahu and these Zionist policies. They might not particularly like Netanyahu, but they're entirely in favor of the ethnic cleansing, though they wouldn't call it that. But there is a significant minority within that, the Zionist establishment of this country that I think understands how this has really hurt their cause. So you have people like Chuck Schumer who are ardent Zionists. But they understand that this looks really bad. And they're also, because most of these people are not Trump supporters. Most of them are Democrats. And they don't like this alliance between Israel and Trump. It looks bad to them. It looks bad domestically, among their people, among their fellow Democrats. And so they do want to see a change of course. And I think it's mainly for the reasons that you set out. It's just that it's not that they're abandoning Zionism, but they understand that this Zionism in its current iteration is a real bad sell. It looks bad and is putting the whole cause at risk.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the damage it's done to the U.S. global image, I think, can't be understated. I feel like prior to October 7th, or let's say prior to the Ukraine war especially, I think the majority of countries in the world, majority of people around the world would be like, yeah, we're happy with the U.S. as in its position as the global leader. Right now, do you think that any country in the world wants to see the U.S. as the head of the world, other than Israel?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'm sure there are some, but probably few and far between.
Like what? I can't think of any.
I don't know. Right. Yeah, definitely Israel. But, especially after this tariffs, because he went after the whole world. That's the thing. It's just like everybody is suffering from this attack. And so there are a lot of countries that are, again, are calling up Trump and begging for mercy. But that's not love. That's fear. That's these smaller countries. And there are, many of them around the world. There are a lot of small countries that really threw in their lot with the U.S. and have made themselves entirely dependent. They've been very good vassals, especially some of these small countries like Fiji or something that always votes with Israel and the U.S. and the United Nations when almost the entire rest of the world votes the other way. But they too got slapped with sanctions. That's like the crazy thing. So it's just, right. The end result is there's really very little love for the U.S. I think that's got to be true. This is enormously damaging.
Right. I mean, even these countries like Fiji or Micronesia, I mean, they've been bought off to support certain causes and vote a certain way. But I'm sure the people themselves are like, oh, we love Israel and Micronesia. Yeah, I imagine they have phones they can see. So yeah, that's just writing on the wall then, right? I mean, nobody wants the U.S. as top dog anymore. And if nobody wants it, it's just people will cheer and support the countries that are standing up. We're going to see people be supporting, and we're already seeing it. We're seeing people support countries that we thought unimaginable that most of the world would begin to support. Countries like China or Russia or Iran or Yemen. Mm-hmm. All these countries. And why are people supporting them? Because they're standing up to the United States, right? That's the primary reason. Right. And we can see that the whole globe is shifting towards that. Right. And the U.S. is just trying to play whack-a-mole and smack everybody down. Yeah. You get a tariff, we'll bomb you, and everybody's like, just give it a rest. Nobody likes you anymore. Right.
Yeah, well, no, it's true. I guess, those countries that have stood up have become increasingly popular. The bet was on the U.S. side is that, everybody they assumed again that they had this great reservoir of support, and they did, but by their actions they greatly reduced that, and and further hostile actions will reduce it even more. So these countries are, maybe a poll would show that there's, I don't know now after the tariffs, but probably prior to the tariffs, that most people, still support or see the U.S. as a leader and are kind of willing to accept that. Maybe. But the popularity of these other countries is growing. There's no question. The countries that you listed, and they're growing. There's a certain respect for them because they stood up. And now, it took a few brave countries to do that. And I think we really have to point to Iran as the first, because they were by themselves when they first stood up to the U.S. If you go back to the Islamic Revolution at the end of the 70s, and they've held their ground, but now they're being joined. It's like they were all alone for a while, but now they have very powerful partners. They have Russia and China. And by the way, they recently had a conference, those three countries, the representatives of the three countries, to discuss the nuclear program. I think they're just coordinating their position vis-a-vis the United States and Trump. Now the world's seeing this. These maybe still be outliers, but there is a point. Especially following these tariffs, that there are more and more countries are going to just say, no, I've had it. And you have a few brave souls at first, but at some point it becomes kind of, the whole process accelerates, where there may just be a few people standing off, but at some point it becomes a stampede. And it's just like, okay, when all those countries that are those governments that have been kind of are timid, or, are just maybe acting against their own feelings, but acting on what they see to be their own interests. At some point, it ceases to even be in their own interest, and they just go to the other side. So we may see some sort of stampede like that at some point.
Right. I think it's happening fast. It's all happening so fast. I mean, prior to the Ukraine war, the world was just completely different, and now this, coupled with the tariffs and what happened on October 7th. It's all changed, and what I'm seeing now, if we do this war with Iran, I think that's the end. I mean, am I being hyperbolic if I say that this is the beginning of the end right now? I think what we're seeing right now, it's
right.
There's been brought for a while.
Yeah. Again, I think, as I said before, this is not. We're not talking about something that might take place in the future. It's already starting. It's obviously the stampede hasn't happened. The dollar hasn't collapsed yet, but it's starting to. It really is. We're seeing all these things happening right now. And American soft power has been greatly diminished. And I think American economic power, when this tariff war comes to an end, if it ever does, will be greatly diminished. It was already, much less than what it once was. It's not because, America's economy was shrinking, but it's just the rest of the world quite naturally was catching up, and in some cases, like in the case of China, really surpassing it.
Are you happy this is the beginning of the end?
I guess I just feel the necessity. This is something that had to happen. I mean, I think it really was going to happen. It was a question of when rather than if. And it seemed it's all happening more quickly than I had, anticipated. But, I think, there's just no question. American power, for the sake of Americans themselves and for the world, American hegemony is what I should say, needs to come to an end. It's not good for America. It's not good for the world. We need to truly have a humbler foreign policy. We can continue to be a great power. You could be a responsible great power, and we could actually prosper that way. But that's, our political class refuses to do that. They hang on to this notion of American hegemony. And so that just has to end. And, the great danger, of course, is that, our refusal to bow out gracefully, it could mean, is resulting in major wars. And it could and there are probably going to be more wars in the future. And we're looking at a very dangerous phase ahead of us as America, since it won't gracefully bow out, it's going to be forced out of its position as hegemon.
I know you don't like giving predictions, but what does that really mean when we're forced out of our position? Does that mean that America is going to descend into chaos here, that we'll break apart, America will still be isolated, that we'll be just a very poor country? I mean, what happens if we lose the world reserve currency status, if we lose some major military wars, and then we no longer have that illusion of military supremacy anymore? What and then also just any sense of moral supremacy, this idea that everybody loves America, that has vanished as well. Once that's all gone and the dust starts to settle, what kind of America are we looking at?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's just something like I couldn't have predicted. Nobody could predict the crazy things that have happened during these last few years. You just ask any one of us from even 5 years ago, pre-COVID. It's just been one thing after another. And so I think that's a fool's errand to make a firm prediction. I think, again, it's just the prediction I will make is the one that you just laid out there, is that, America will decline. America, will cease to be the hegemon. And again, that could be, though that would be very painful, like America will become poorer as it loses its reserve currency status. It will become poorer, but it doesn't necessarily need to become a poor nation. It's actually still a very wealthy nation. It has a lot of resources. It can turn things around. You can't turn around overnight or even just a few years, but over the course of a decade, we could start building up a new country, there's no reason why we can't, even if we lose our great power status for a while, why we can't regain it. We have this great land with with oceans on both sides and lots of natural resources, and we could do well. But unfortunately, it just that's assuming that at some point a rational group of people take over. And I think, unfortunately, we really can't make that assumption. It's just like the craziness may continue, and it'll take on new forms that we can't even predict at this point. So, it could just become really ugly. We could descend into civil war and all that. I'm not making any firm prediction on that, but it's just like, times of chaos and, major blows to institutions and to identity of a country, that will bring forth, like a completely new and unforeseeable movements. And, as it did in China, it's just like, China went through a long period of chaos. It was hard for them. They too, had the sense of being the great nation of the world, and their political class, to say, the emperor and his people had a lot of trouble accepting that. In contrast, of course, to the Japanese, who very quickly realized, we got to learn from these people. We got to just completely reform our entire system. It's like they tried to hang on to it until the whole thing just collapsed. And then you had this period of chaos, and you had different movements arise that had really crackpot ideas, like, who am I thinking of right now? But anyway, and then eventually the communists took over, and that wasn't the solution to the problem, of course, because these were the communists under Mao, and they launched a series of reforms that were actually, all in all, very destructive. But eventually, we're talking about like over the course of 100 years, we finally got rational people in charge. And I think it's very fair to say that, we've, ever since Deng Xiaoping, China has been governed by rational people. And, they clearly have rebuilt China. China always had these great resources, human resources and natural resources. And now they are a great nation again. So I don't know if it's going to take us 100 years.
Yeah, but I don't like that. I mean, you can kind of say this, similar with the Soviet Union in a way, right? As well, to the Bolshevik Revolution, it was a long time before we got some rationality and
Yeah.
And so it's scary because what we saw with the example of Germany or Japan, that required a massive military defeat, just the countries destroyed. And then there was kind of a rapid rebound. But it seems like when there's sort of just a general decay and rotten collapse, it seems to be a lot tougher to pick up the pieces, at least in the historical examples you gave.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's anything to draw on, but...
Yeah. No, it's certainly possible. I find myself thinking about China, and it's 100 years of humiliation and chaos, and I don't know. I think there's no reason to think that we can't go through that. We could. Life in the U.S. is still pretty good, but it's just the chaos that we're seeing at the top is going to start having real consequences. Already has had consequences, and the consequences are going to become much more severe in the future. And I don't know what that's going to lead to, but I doubt that there's going to be a sudden awakening. Unfortunately, it's just like the conversation within the U.S. is not about really the good of the entire nation, and it's not really about it's again hyperpartisan, and that's just sort of that rather than being a way to bring this hyperpartisanship is just sort of a further acceleration of the circling of the drain. It's just like, again, there's a refusal to really look at the larger problems and just to focus on the enemy that you hate. And I think that's bringing us all down.
Okay, so we've used terms like we're circling the drain, it's the beginning of the end, empire collapse, it's not a rosy picture. Is there anything we should do to prepare for this event? I think nothing is certain. Who knows?
Right.
Who knows what might happen? But it does sound like we are witnessing the beginning of the end of this. We've been witnessing it for a while, but it's beginning to accelerate. I feel like we're entering a new stage because we've covered. I think these are three huge things that we talked about. Just the economic war that we're going to lose. The military supremacy has been questioned and is no longer, our military dominance isn't there. And I think one of the biggest, most important things is that people don't want the United States to be the leader of the world anymore. We have lost our moral standing. So we no longer are beloved by the world. And we are seeing people stand up for the so-called bad countries that that the U.S. has been pushing upon the world: China, Iran, Russia, Yemen. And so I feel like this is monumental. We really have, we are coming, we're living through this right now. And I live in America. Should I prepare? Should I move?
That's for another show or something, another channel. I really, and there are channels out there that are just devoted to those questions. Well, your sister made the choice of emigrating to Russia, so, but...
I was in China 10 years, came back 2-3 years ago, and I'm like, maybe I got to go back to Shanghai. I really love Shanghai, but I like it here too, it's just...
again, we may... No firm predictions, and maybe that certain parts of the country will do, are going to descend into chaos, and other parts of the country will do all right. Hopefully our part of the country will, but I'm not going to make any firm predictions. It's just, there's just too many unknowns, and I think it's again, the clouds, the murkiness in the crystal ball, really prevent any sort of, any exercise in prediction making.
Okay, well, we'll just watch it unfold. Just watching a slow motion train wreck right now. Okay.
That's not all that slow motion, it seems like. I mean, it really seems like sometimes I think it's kind of just slowing down, and then something comes out of left field, and
it seems like we have multiple train wrecks happening. Yeah, that's why it's like, whoa, got to focus on this one, watch this one. So it's,
right.
Yeah. Okay, all right, well, thanks a lot, Dad. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about on Friday.
Okay, very good.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.